Good day, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on the real-world relevance of information literacy, Part 2, the factors that make information literacy relevant in a post-truth era. This is a sequel to an article that was written for the ECIL 2017 conference relating to the early doctoral work which I was investigating specifically for real-world relevance of information literacy. Let's talk for just a moment about this idea of living in a post-truth era. Oxford Dictionaries announced post-truth was the word of the year in 2016. Our post-truth era can be considered in context of an emerging information ecology, where information is created and abounds without filters. In the recent past, before the internet and social media became easily accessible, news and information moved more slowly across populations and continents. False stories could be more easily filtered before being shared or propagated and perpetuated without questions or the processes to validate information. As an information literate society, applying critical thinking, the discipline of information literacy rises in importance for our academic workplace and real-world successes. So in 2016, when Oxford Dictionaries chose post-truth as the word of the year, was relating to or denoting circumstances where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion, but rather what is appealing to emotion or a personal belief. In short, people can believe whatever they want to believe as long as they feel that it's right. So this would introduce the idea of alternative facts or opinion versus facts, which is a very fluid space. Arajuo found or noted that more than simply false information, this is an ethos or a culture that has a bit of a disdain for truth. So the speed at which information is now shared has played a part in this post-truth era and has disrupted the traditional ways where journalists would find a way to correct news that was mistakenly printed or reported. And the journalistic culture was providing apologies when or if appropriate. So what is fake news? What is this idea of fake news? Fake news is really anything but new. Propaganda, gossip, political or social pressures have influenced how news is shared. There's personal agendas and bias. And in the recent past, before the internet and social media became easily accessible, news and information moved more slowly. And so false stories were quite common and not easily corrected. So this idea of fake news tends to be sensationalist or extreme, and it's designed to play on one's feelings and emotions. Misinformation is this idea that information is false, but not created with an intention of causing harm, whereas disinformation is not only false, but even created to deliberately create harm to a person, a social group, organization, or even a country. And so disinformation is a subset of the idea of misinformation. So considering this idea of information literacy in the post-truth era, I have suggested a few bullets here to consider before I introduce some of the findings from my doctoral work, which investigated the socio-cognitive relevance of information literacy to college students. So these bullets include considering information literacy, first of all, as transdisciplinary. So it is applicable across disciplines, not only in academia, but also in our everyday information use and for workplace information literacy. Information literate citizenry are critical thinkers. They think, they consider, they evaluate, they consider bias. An information literate society is aware of potential bias that might be being filtered through different kinds of information shared either in the news or on social media channels or just amongst the general population. Information literacy also acknowledges that information, experiences, and knowledge as assets of our users, of the people who are using and engaging with information. And then finally, information literacy addresses this global view of information use, meaning our world and our culture is now very global, and we have to consider the ways in which information is shared, used, interpreted, and evaluated. So moving right along, I'd like to talk for a bit about some of the findings from, or high-level summary findings of my doctoral study, which investigated the sociocognitive relevance of information literacy. The primary research question for this study was, how is information literacy relevant to undergraduate student academic work from a sociocognitive user view? The methodology was mixed methods using a cross-sectional two-stage sequential explanatory design. Stage 1 used an online survey, and stage 2 used focus groups to gather qualitative data to further describe, expound on, and identify the factors that make information literacy relevant to college students when they applied it to their academic work. So stage 1 that addressed the secondary research question, what are undergraduate student perceptions of the sociocognitive relevance of information literacy to their academic work? Using an online survey to gather quantitative data, there were 10 information literacy competencies identified and described for participants, which I'll share in just a moment. These competencies were identified using both the Association of College and Research Libraries Standards of Information Literacy for Higher Education, first adopted in 2000, and also the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, adopted in 2016. These were mapped to create the questions for the survey. The reason for using both of the language from both of these areas was, at the time of my study, the standards had not been rescinded and the framework had not yet been adopted. So before we go any further, it's important to define these terms that were measured in the survey to identify sociocognitive relevance. The socio piece was defined as usefulness, and using or providing for the survey participants this definition, that usefulness is defined as your perception of how valuable or essential the application of an information competency is to the completion of your paper assignment. And then the cognitive side was defined using the term meaningfulness. And this was the user view or judgment of when information literacy competencies were important for the completion of the assignment. So these operationalized terms were very important in order to measure this subjective type of relevance. And so we were able to empirically look at data to look at this type of relevance related to information literacy. These are the 10 questions, or excuse me, competencies that students identified as either being useful or meaningful using the online survey. And you can see that much of the language either leans into or towards or combines both ACRL standards and framework language. The stage 2 piece of this study addressed the secondary research question, what are the factors impacting the sociocognitive relevance of information literacy competencies to academic work? And this was created using focus groups. And so the focus groups helped to further provide information or insights as to what makes information literacy relevant to our college students. Next, I'll share just some high-level findings from this doctoral study and identify some of the things that were most notable to answer the research question. So first, the quantitative stage using that online survey, the full participant pool was 392 students, but this survey population, based on a number of factors, ended up being 132 students. And you can see from the chart here, a variety of different programs were represented in this survey study population as compared to what is represented at the college. So we were very pleased that we had a good distribution of different programs being represented in that survey population. This chart indicates from the online survey whether students found or how they found information literacy competencies to be useful or meaningful, either not at all sociocognitive relevant, somewhat sociocognitive relevant, or very. And you can see that each question or competency is identified as a competency 1, U is useful, and competency 1, for instance, M is meaningful. And so this is a radar graph that identifies that mostly what you see are students who say that these competencies, as both useful and meaningful, are either sociocognitive relevant or very sociocognitively relevant to them. This chart provides a little more detail as to the average or the mean of the way the participants replied. And so you can see that some of these competencies are thought to be or reflected, perceived as more meaningful or more useful. And interestingly, those have not been investigated more fully, but I think there's certainly room to do a little more investigation with these differences. We used a 4-point Likert type scale in order to gather this data. So quickly, the quantitative findings summary provides these particular notes. First, overall participants said that information literacy was relevant to them in order to complete their assignments. The survey data shows that when students applied these competencies, there was a high percentage of self-reported improvement in their information literacy work. I also did a bivariate analysis looking at associations to certain demographic data. And interestingly, this analysis found that there was not a strong association with what may typically have been areas that one would think would be impactful to student perceptions of competence with information literacy. So understanding that, these descriptive types of attributes are not necessarily really impactful to the relevance of information literacy, we want to maybe consider going forward what is. And so our qualitative data helped us look at some other factors there. So the stage 2 focus groups were completed after the survey data had been collected. And there were 4 focus groups, and the object was to learn what were the factors that make information literacy relevant to our students. And what we found was 1 overarching, what we call an Uber factor, 9 key factors, and 11 dimensional factors. So the Uber factor is the knowledge base, what students know already. And from that, there were 10 key factors that emerged: digital literacy, the academic discipline where they were working, their information literacy awareness, the understanding of acquiring new knowledge when using information literacy, how information literacy could be applied to the real world, using a research process, their own critical thinking, being involved, using information literacy in the scholarly conversation, and then engaging their curiosity, passion, and motivation. 11 dimensional factors were also identified, and these were related to key factors, but all of the factors of relevance emerge from the Uber factor, their knowledge base, what they already know. Here are a few of the quotes that students provided. There are some examples that help to show how they identify these factors of relevance of information literacy. So, for example, using thematic analysis, these quotes were identified and coded. So for the Uber factor, their knowledge base, students said, this is useful because you can use it, information literacy. It's meaningful because you can use it over and over. So now you know their knowledge base, and it's just useful for any of our other assignments. The key factor, their student experience, relates, as an example, the digital literacy key factor. Like when we would look for books that we would need for our project, I felt it very important with the way the system was able to find those easily. I thought it was cool that it did seem rather easy to access the books, useful. I feel that being able to search for information like the books would be very relevant because otherwise you wouldn't be able to research information at all. And then you wouldn't be able to gain as much knowledge, that meaningful piece, and you wouldn't do as well in college. An example of a dimensional factor, which relates to the student perception or views, and this is the dimensional factor of information literacy being articulated. The more we know, the more information literacy vocabulary we understand. And then also, yes, information literacy and vocabulary, were more relevant when you went over examples of how to do this and that. And so just a summary of these benefits of using information literacy that emerged from the qualitative stage of this study was that students using information literacy experienced faster completion of assignments. They also experienced less procrastination because they were more confident about being able to apply information literacy to their academic assignment. Improved papers or final products were identified by participants who applied information literacy to their academic work, and participants cited they were more confident in the evidence or the finding and using authoritative sources being produced in their academic writing assignment task. Finally, some implications and the conclusion. Sociocognitive relevance was measured as being useful and meaningful in this study. So this is a way to measure the subjective type of relevance that's been difficult to sort of wrap our hands around quantitatively, for sure, over some time. We also identified information literacy relevance factors, those factors that make information literacy relevant to our students. As a result of this, we also identified something called the kaleidoscope effect, or the metacognitive information experience reflected in these different factors, which students experienced all at once. This metacognitive way, nonlinear experience of engaging with information for their academic tasks, using information and information literacy in a way that help them make sense in their information exploration. So the information kaleidoscope effect in the post-truth era really allows us to consider not only these factors that make information literacy relevant as we teach in the academy, but also as we engage informally with students or in our information professions. Paying attention to the information literacy vocabulary, defining it, using it, and helping to make it more explicit as we engage with different students and different faculty and different colleagues in our information environment. We also recognize that students' perceptions of information literacy in the post-truth era require us to be more engaging with the way in which we talk about information literacy. And then finally, in the academy, being able to use these factors that make information literacy relevant, more explicit, and partnering with our faculty in order to do that more intentionally. And lastly, recognizing as the Uber factor what they already know, the assets that they have in terms of their knowledge base and information literacy, so we can guide our students and others to build on these knowledge assets. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to take comments and questions.